European officials continue to react strongly to President Trump's threat to enforce penalties on companies that continue to do business with Iran in violation of the sanctions the US is reinstating with its withdrawal of the deal. Now, the reaction's been particularly strong in France, a co-signer of that deal. Here's what French Economy Minister Bruno Le Maire had to say on the topic.
Qu'est-ce que nous voulons être?
What do we want to be? Do we want to be vassals deferring with a curtsy and a bow to decisions made by the US so that the US become the world economic police? Or do we want us European people to say that we have our own economic interests? We want to keep on doing business with Iran in the frame of a strategic deal which was agreed and where Iran abandons its nuclear weapons. We think it is the right thing to do and we are keeping on doing business with Iran. This is the question of principle asked here.
Et donc, nous continuons à faire le commerce avec l'Iran.
Well, joining us now for more is Stan Veuger. He's an economist at the American Enterprise Institute. Stan, we are hearing some strong words from Europe, especially from the French, about the shift in U.S. policy. How much of that frustration, that anger is justified on their part, and how are they likely to react going forward?
Well, I think basically all of their frustration is justified. They struck an agreement with the U.S., with Iran, with other countries, and now ultimately it's the U.S. that's about to violate that by sanctioning European companies that were counting on being able to trade with Iran for as long as Iran would stick by the terms of the agreement, which, you know, everyone agrees it's basically been doing. So I think, you know, when the U.S. suddenly threatens to impose sanctions on European companies, it's reasonable for those European countries to be upset.
And do you think this could spill over into trade relations with Europe?
Well, you know, it's of course not the first time this year that the U.S. has suddenly decided to impose trade restrictions on European companies and European countries. Earlier this year, the U.S. decided to stick a tariff on steel and aluminum, also on national security grounds, that were, you know, basically injustifiable under any reasonable reading of the trade agreement, of the trade rules in question. And so I can see why the EU countries are getting a little annoyed by this.
And let me ask you something. I just want to follow up on that. Do you really think that the U.S. is going to follow through in a hard way on some of these companies, major companies in Europe that are doing some business with Iran? I mean, really, that could be a major cause of discord certainly between France and the U.S. And let's throw Germany in there too.
I mean, the U.S. kind of has to, because there isn't much else to the U.S. sanctions on Iran. Most of the trade Iran does with the participants in the Iran agreement is with non-American companies and actors. So if the U.S. does not do exactly that, then its own withdrawal from the deal has very limited teeth. So I don't see what they're going to do if not that.
Stan, I want to move over to another area where it seems like the Iran deal is going to impact on the economy, and that is on the price of oil. We just saw today, slight drop, but it's still over $77 a barrel. I'm talking Brent crude, and U.S. oil, of course, hit over that $70 barrel mark. Bank of America coming out and saying that early next year, the price of Brent could go up to over $100 a barrel, something we haven't seen in a while. What's your feeling? You think we're looking at oil, Brent at least, over $100 a barrel?
That seems a little unlikely to me. We have to remember that the U.S. has a lot of oil capacity now and a lot of shale oil capacity that can be brought online relatively quickly. So I think that imposes an upper bound on oil prices that is lower than what we were used to, say, a decade ago. So, you know, there's obviously a tail risk, and there are adjustment costs. There's some delay in adjusting to increasing oil prices, but I don't think that risk is as big as it was, you know, a decade or certainly a generation ago.
And how do you think the oil, if what you say, we're not going to over $100 a barrel, we're still quite high. We're in the 70s, both Brent and U.S. oil. What kind of impact going ahead do you see on the U.S. economy and on the consumer? We're coming to the summer months, heavy use of gasoline. Could this be a political problem for President Trump?
I do think so, because obviously, consumers will immediately notice the impact of increased oil prices. For the U.S. for the U.S. economy as a whole, the impact is a little different now because the U.S. has become such a major producer itself. But that doesn't mean that consumers will not bear the consequences of an increase in oil prices. But for the U.S. economy as a whole, I think the effect is not as strong as it would have been before the U.S. became such a large producer.
Well, maybe not as strong as the U.S. economy. Let's look at some other economies because, of course, who benefits? Countries like Russia and Iran could benefit as the price. I mean, in a sense, isn't it a little self-defeating? The whole point of pulling out of the deal and toughening the sanctions is to damage the Iranian economy. But if oil is going up into the 80s, it was in the 30s I think at the early last year. Certainly, that is self-defeating for the goal of the Trump administration.
Well, the idea is that Iran will not be able to sell that oil, but obviously that requires a level of international cooperation that is hard to imagine given the way in which these sanctions are being reimposed.
And I want to ask you just on the Saudi role, because there was talk even before this that they wanted the price of oil up there because they want to privatize their state-owned company, Aramco. Again, the Saudis seem to be working at a little bit of cross purposes, at least with the Trump administration on that issue. And President Trump directly attacked OPEC in some of his tweets.
Yeah, I mean, look, like on many of these issues, the U.S. policy seems to have multiple contradictory goals, right? If you want oil prices to be low, sanctioning Iran may not be the greatest way to get there. If you want your trade deficit to be small, then a large corporate tax cut may not be the way to get there. I think it's hard to explain all of these different policy moves as being part of a grand, coherent narrative.
Okay, grand, coherent narratives do not seem to be the order of the day in Washington. Stan Veuger,